Week 11. Overview. Crash. The Great Depression in America. This week begins the study of another hard time in the 20th century, the Great Depression. The financial crisis began with the crash of the bull market. With the plunge of the stock market went the hopes and dreams of many Americans. At first, no one knew how bad it really was. Various experts made sincere and forceful predictions that happier days were just around the corner, but things got worse and worse instead. Different people had different experiences during America's Great Depression. Students on all levels will be learning about the various aspects of everyday life during the early 30s. For most farmers, things went from really bad to intolerable. For many businessmen and manufacturers, the Great Depression meant financial ruin. For many homeowners, the bank failures and losses of jobs cost them their homes as well as their livelihoods. As with all trying situations, different folks reacted in different ways. Some ended their lives in despair. Others hung on, but with little hope for the future. Some Americans turned to violence or crime, others to works of charity and mercy. The Great Depression humbled most Americans, and according to what was already in their hearts, revealed the best and the worst in all. Meanwhile, in the 20s and early 30s, Joseph Stalin was tightening his grip on every aspect of the lives of his people. He looked to control their occupations, their social lives, their very thoughts and beliefs. For many, he succeeded. Those who resisted him were slain, often in horrendous ways. In the 20s and early 30s, Stalin caused more deaths among his own people than all the participating countries of World War I had suffered together. Dialectic and rhetoric students will have the sad duty of reading about these difficult times in Russia this week. But let's start with America's troubles. They began with the stock market crash. The first day of widespread panic about falling stock market prices occurred on Thursday, October 24th, but it took 5 more days for the worst to hit. On Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, investors frantically unloaded 16 million shares. The stocks lost more than $26 billion in value in one day. Some brokers and financiers were so devastated by their financial losses that they committed suicide. Some leaped out the windows on Wall Street. That was scary, and it helped start a domino effect that led to the Great Depression. What began as one bad week on Wall Street turned into a 10-year economic slump. Here's how it happened. Since middle-class Americans lost their capital, they could no longer buy discretionary items. Manufacturers therefore cut back significantly on production, which meant laying off many workers. These unemployed people, in turn, didn't spend money on goods that they could live without since they'd been laid off. This cycle was constantly repeated. As markets shrank further, more people were laid off, and so forth. As unemployment soared and people were unable to pay their loans, families pulled their money out of banks, which then had no assets to cover other loans. Banks began to fail, where they survived by keeping people from accessing their own money. This kept people from putting their money back into the economy as well. President Hoover responded to this economic crisis to a degree. He asked American businessmen to maintain prices and wages. He proposed a federal tax cut, an interest rate cut, and proposed a plan that would aid homeowners who could not meet their payments using federal funds. Hoover's principles kept him from offering federal funds to individuals. He thought that was not the role of the federal government. Instead, he thought states or private charities should relieve the needs of the unemployed. The problem was that the state and local governments and private charities were all overwhelmed by the crisis. They couldn't handle the widespread and deepening emergency. They were unable to meet the great financial needs that their constituents were facing. That left Hoover caught in the middle. While some Americans felt that Hoover was stepping beyond his boundaries and turning the government into radical socialism with the measures that he did take, most felt that he wasn't doing enough to help. When 15,000 war veterans decided to march on Washington to request relief, Hoover refused to budge. Without aid, many of the veterans had nowhere else to go, so they set up camp in shanty towns. Hoover ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear them out. Hoover never recovered from the spectacle of soldiers using tear gas and tanks on impoverished veterans. Hoover paid a price for his principles. Shanty towns, makeshift houses of cardboard or tin cans, warmed by scrap wood fires and oil drums that were formed in vacant lots or along highways as people lost their homes and jobs had nowhere else to go. These were disease-ridden, cold, and miserable places, and they were eventually dubbed Hoovervilles for the do-nothing president. Broken-down cars, which became homes for people, were hitched to mules for locomotion. These were derisively called Hoover wagons. People wrapped themselves in discarded, dirty newspapers to try to keep warm. Cold and homeless people called these Hoover blankets. One of the few things Hoover did about the crisis did more harm than good. In 1930, he supported the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, an act of Congress which was supposed to protect the American economy by imposing extra costs on foreign producers. Unfortunately, Hoover didn't count on all the foreign countries retaliating by passing their own protective tariffs. Between the General Depression and all the new tariffs, the value of world trade fell by more than 50% by 1932. A natural and man-made disaster called the Dust Bowl added to the nation's woes. The Roaring Twenties had not been kind to farmers, but things got worse in 1930 when a severe drought exposed the damages wrought by overfarming and overgrazing the arid lands of the Great Plains. Cattle had eaten the prairie grasses right down to the roots. When it didn't rain, there was nothing to hold the dusty soil together. People were driven from their homes and farms by the massive dust storms that destroyed their land and made farming impossible. As such families made their way west to California, they increased the number of unemployed people looking for work and only deepened the problems of the Great Depression. Roosevelt was governor of New York when Wall Street crashed. Like Hoover, he initially assumed things would get better soon. Like Hoover, he thought that state government should help out people in need. FDR had no objection to helping people. His polio had taught him what it was like to rely on others for even the simple task of getting dressed. Roosevelt led the New York state government in setting up a temporary emergency relief administration, the TERA, to provide jobs for the unemployed and food, clothing, and shelter for those who had none. Roosevelt's vigorous government response in New York State made him an attractive candidate for the election of 1932. While Hoover maintained a hands-off policy at the federal level, Roosevelt demonstrated his hands-on approach as governor. Now, while all this was going on in the United States, another kind of program was underway in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Joseph Stalin was restructuring the Russian economy. The 5-year plan was an economic policy that pushed industrial development forward and radically reorganized Russian agriculture. Stalin turned Russia's 25 million private farms into collectives, shared farms, owned by the Russian state. Any peasant who did not peacefully submit to collectivization was executed, exiled, or sent to labor camps. Many Russian peasants fought back, even when that meant fighting military troops with their pitchforks. Others destroyed their own crops, livestock, and farm machinery so the communists couldn't use it. Many of the peasants who submitted still starved to death, as Stalin took 5 million tons of grain and exported it, refusing to give any back to the starving farmers. Stalin's 5-year plan had accomplished his purposes, but at the cost of millions of Russian lives. One would expect such actions would have made Stalin so unpopular that the Russian people would have risen up in revolt. But Stalin maintained tight control over all the Russian media. Propaganda spread Stalin's fame into every classroom, public building, factory, and city. The textbook said what he wanted them to say, whether it was true or not. Soon, Stalin had banned all books that did not support his dictatorship. Stalin successfully controlled many aspects of his people's lives: jobs, schools, churches, art, and literature. The only way to pursue a career in Russia was to join a union: teachers' unions, artists' unions, industry union, and so forth. Each local union was a communist cell, and each had informants and secret police who monitored and observed members and applicants for their loyalty and their party enthusiasm. Out of fear, workers learned to put on public faces that masked what they really thought. Stalin understood that he who rocks the cradle rules the world. He sought to inculcate the youth with all of his most extreme ideas. The communists controlled all grade school curricula and teachers, and their one goal was to brainwash the youth of Russia to make them loyal cogs in their communist machinery. Children learned how easy it was to intimidate their own parents with threats of turning them in. Parents were powerless to contradict what the children learned in school. They knew their children could be taken from them, and they themselves would disappear if anyone suspected them of thought crimes. Stalin saw religious beliefs, especially the dominant one in his country, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, as a threat to his power. He set about destroying the organizations, principles, and beliefs of people in the Judeo-Christian traditions. He then substituted himself for a god figure in Russia. People were taught to believe that Stalin was the greatest thinker of all time, all-wise and all-knowing, and that he was the source of all goodness in their lives. Stalin's morality rested upon his overriding goal, to establish communism worldwide with himself as the head of all communist governments. Stalin taught that all means were justified by their ends. The end of the good of the communist movement justified any means: torture, murder, genocide, suppression of civil rights, privation, destruction of family ties and religious devotions. All must be subservient to the state and to Stalin himself. It's hard to believe that anybody could really do what Stalin did. While President Hoover and Governor Roosevelt were doing what they could for their suffering people during the Great Depression, Stalin actually created a famine in order to crush the peasants' resistance to the Soviet regime. People of goodwill can disagree over whether Hoover's hands-off policy or FDR's government intervention was the best way to deal with the Depression, but there is simply no comparison between America's differing political approaches to helping people and Stalin's cold-blooded use of government power to achieve his Marxist ends.